I looked him dead in the eyes, my voice trembling as I asked for the one thing any partner should give: a little bit of his time. He didn't even look up from his screen. Instead, he sighed, a sound full of such heavy, calculated exhaustion that it made me feel like an anchor dragging him into the depths. Then, he said it. He told me he had a clinical obsession with how much my body repulsed him. He told me that my presence in the house he begged me to move across an ocean to live in, felt like a prison sentence. How does a love story turn into a psychological thriller where you're the victim? How do you go from being someone's digital obsession to a ghost haunting their spare room? I didn't realize it then, but I was being erased piece by piece by a man who claimed to be the only person in the world who would ever truly accept me. But the most terrifying part wasn't the insults or the coldness. It was the sinking realization that, while he was telling me I was crazy for suspecting him, he was already building a life that didn't include me. And he was doing it right in front of my face. It all started in the most toxic way possible: an argument. We didn't meet through a cute dating app or a mutual friend. We met in the trenches of an online comment section, trading barbs and debating things that don't even matter now. From the very first second, he was aggressive. He accused me of things, questioned my character, and seemed to think the absolute worst of me. But for some reason, he wouldn't go away. It was like he was addicted to the friction between us. He'd push, and when I'd finally had enough and tried to walk away, he'd flip the script. He'd become this vulnerable, misunderstood soul who just wanted to be heard. For a long time, I tried to keep him at arm's length. I told him we could only be friends. I didn't want the drama. I didn't want the intensity. But the moment I set that boundary, he vanished. He told me it was too painful to just be my friend and went silent for 2 months. During that time, he found someone else, an ex, and suddenly the arguments stopped because I didn't exist to him anymore. But as soon as that fell apart, he was back in my inbox, apologizing, admitting he treated me badly and begging for my attention. He was like a vacuum, sucking up every bit of emotional energy I had. If I didn't respond fast enough, he'd spiral. He'd accuse me of replacing him or having backups waiting in the wings. If my messages weren't long enough or didn't seem enthusiastic enough, he'd claim I didn't actually want to speak to him. It was exhausting, but at the time, I mistook his possessiveness for passion. I thought, no one has ever cared this much about whether I'm talking to them. I didn't realize it was control dressed up as devotion. At the time, I was in a very vulnerable place. I was struggling with my weight, and my social anxiety was so paralyzing that the digital world felt like the only safe place I had. I told him everything. I bared my soul, including my deepest insecurities about my body. He played the part of the hero perfectly. He told me he didn't mind. He said he was the last person who would ever judge me, and that he accepted me exactly as I was, no matter what. Eventually, the pressure started. He pushed for things to turn sexual, and even though I felt hesitant, he made me feel like I owed it to the connection we had built. He made me feel like if I didn't engage in that way, I was rejecting the only person who truly saw me. So, I gave in. We made plans to finally meet in person, and I thought this would be the moment everything clicked. I thought the insecurity and the online arguments would melt away once we were finally in the same room. I was so wrong. The moment we met in person, the atmosphere shifted from long-distance longing to clinical coldness. The man who had been all over me digitally suddenly couldn't find a single reason to be near me physically. He rejected me almost immediately, coming up with these elaborate, nonsensical reasons why he couldn't be intimate. And when I tried to initiate, he didn't just turn me down, he criticized me for it. He made me feel like a predator for wanting the very thing he had pressured me into doing online. It was humiliating. We'd be out in public and he'd refuse to hold my hand. This was a man who just days prior had talked about how much he couldn't wait to touch me. Now, he told me he disliked PDA and acted like even standing next to me was an embarrassment. When we were finally intimate, it didn't feel like a connection. It felt forced, like he was checking a box on a list of chores he didn't want to do. But I was trapped, not just emotionally, but financially. I was in a hard place, and he knew it. He started sending me money, offering to help me out, and eventually, he insisted on buying me things I didn't even ask for. He'd buy them over my head, and then, the moment an argument started, he'd throw them in my face. He called me ungrateful. He made sure I knew that every cent he spent was a debt I owed him, a debt I could only pay with my compliance. Then came the grand gesture. He asked me to move back to the UK with him. I told him I shouldn't. I told him I didn't have enough money to support myself there, that I'd be completely dependent on him. He brushed my concerns aside like they were nothing. "I'll support you," he promised. "We'll be a team." I wanted to believe him so badly that I ignored the screaming sirens in the back of my head. I packed my life into a few suitcases and followed him across the world. And that's when the trap truly snapped shut. The moment I arrived in the UK, I became a ghost. I was in a foreign country where I knew no one, living with a man who suddenly seemed to resent the very air I breathed. Everything he did for me, every meal, every drive, every conversation, seemed like a massive burden to him. We'd go entire days without doing anything together, barely speaking a word. If I got upset, if I cried because I felt lonely or unwanted, he wouldn't comfort me. He'd just walk out of the room. He'd go to another part of the house and leave me alone with my thoughts until I learned to keep my mouth shut. That was when he dropped the first real bombshell. He told me he had OCD, but not the kind you're thinking of. He said he had a mental obsession regarding the fact that he didn't find me attractive. He sat me down and explained, in excruciating detail, that he couldn't help but fixate on my flaws. Then, almost in the same breath, he started medication that he claimed killed his libido entirely. I was devastated. I started working on myself even harder. I had already lost weight before we met, but I pushed further. I got down to a healthy weight within a few months of living there. I changed how I dressed, trying to be the woman I thought he wanted. And the sickest part? It worked, but not in the way it should have. Once I lost the weight, once I looked better by his standards, he actually showed more interest, but only to use it as a weapon. He told me, "If you look the way you do now when we first met, I would have been all over you." It was a backhanded compliment that felt like a slap. He was basically admitting that all the "I accept you no matter what" talk from before was a total lie. But as my body changed, his behaviour grew even more erratic. He became distant. He started spending hours, literal hours, in the bathroom on his phone. The intuition I had been trying to suppress for months finally started screaming. I suspected he was cheating. And the moment I brought it up, the gaslighting began. He told me I was ruining his life. He told me I made him feel like a bad person just by questioning him. He'd talk about breaking up, about how miserable he was. But he wouldn't actually leave. He'd just hover there, making me feel like I was a monster for wanting the truth. "If I'm so bad," he'd sneer, "then why are you still here? Why don't you just leave?" But the second I actually went to leave, the second I started packing my bags, he would transform. He'd beg me not to go. He'd cry, he'd promise change. He'd tell me he couldn't live without me. And like a fool, I'd stay. I'd stay because I had nowhere else to go, and because a small, broken part of me still believed the man I met online was in there somewhere. We eventually went to another country for a trip, hoping a change of scenery would fix us. It didn't. He spent the entire time complaining about being there, complaining about being with me. He started calling me codependent and needy because I wanted to actually spend time with him on our vacation. During every single argument, and there were many, He looked me in the eye and told me he didn't love me. He criticized my anxiety, the very thing he once promised to protect. When we got back, the suspicious behavior only ramped up. He was a different person. He was a stranger living in my house, and every time I tried to reach out to him, I just hit a wall of ice. The air in our house had become thick, like walking through waist-deep water just to get from the bedroom to the kitchen. Every time we returned from a trip, whether it was that disastrous time abroad or just a drive to the store, the cycle reset, but the lows got lower. He had this way of making me feel like an intruder in my own life. I'd be sitting on the sofa, and he'd walk into the room, see me, and physically recoil, his face twisting into a mask of irritation before he'd turn around and walk right back out. It was a slow, agonizing erasure. When we weren't arguing, he was escaping. He started leaving the room for no reason at all. One evening stands out vividly in my mind because it was the first time in weeks we had actually agreed to do something together. We were going to watch a movie, just a simple, normal couple thing. I had the pillows fluffed, the lights dimmed, and for a fleeting second I felt a spark of hope. Maybe the ice was finally melting. He stood up and said, "I'm just going to go grab a drink. I'll be right back." I sat there. 5 minutes passed. Then 10, then 20. The movie trailer looped silently on the screen, the blue light of the TV filling the empty room. Eventually, I got up to look for him. I didn't find him in the kitchen. I didn't find him in the bathroom. I finally found him in his brother's room, sitting on the edge of the bed, deep in conversation. When I walked in, he didn't look guilty. He didn't apologize. He just rolled his eyes at me. A look of pure, unadulterated disgust. I tried to stay, to just sit near him and be part of whatever was happening. But he kept giving me these sharp, dirty looks, telling me he'd be out in a minute. He never came back. When I finally gave up and left, he told me his mother was coming in, and since he knew I didn't want to be around her after everything that had happened, I was forced to stay away. It was a calculated move to keep me isolated. He started vanishing for hours at a time. I'd ask where he was and he'd claim he was with his mother. Then, hours later, the story would change. I wasn't actually with her, he'd admit, but he wouldn't tell me where he really was. The secrecy was becoming a wall between us that I couldn't climb over. The final straw came one night when he disappeared again. He didn't tell me where he was going, he just left. Then, my phone buzzed. It was a message from him, out of the blue, asking me if I was cheating. My heart stopped. I asked him where he was, and told him that if anyone was being suspicious, it was him. He didn't respond. I walked through the house, my pulse drumming in my ears, until I found him in the living room. He was sprawled out on the couch, eyes shut, pretending to be fast asleep. But there was one problem. His phone was face down on his chest, still warm. I knew he had just sent that message. I knew he was awake. I told him how suspicious this all looked. I told him that people who aren't hiding things don't act like this. He didn't even open his eyes at first, just let out another one of those heavy, theatrical sighs. He called me controlling. He told me he needed space, but that he couldn't tell me that because I was crazy and would immediately think he was cheating. It was the perfect trap. If I questioned his behavior, I was the unstable one. If I stayed silent, he got to do whatever he wanted. His schedule shifted into something unrecognizable. He started staying up all night on his phone or his laptop, bathed in the blue glow of a screen until the sun came up, only to sleep the entire day away. Or, on the days he did sleep at night, he'd wake up at 4 or 5 in the morning, hours before I had any reason to be up, and sneak out of the room. When I asked why, he had a ready-made excuse. "I didn't want to wake you up with the noise." It was a lie. He always wore earbuds. He'd never cared about waking me up before. I began to realize that he was living a completely separate life while standing 3 feet away from me. I complained that we weren't spending any time together, and he hit me with the most classic line in the gaslighter's handbook. "What are you talking about? We're together 24/7. To him, being in the same house was the same thing as being a couple. He didn't see the difference between staring at a wall in the same room and actually looking me in the eye. Every time I'd reach my breaking point and pack a bag to go home, the routine would repeat. I'd be at the door, ready to leave this misery behind, and he'd crumble. He'd beg, he'd plead, he'd tell me he needed me, that he couldn't do this without me. But the moment I unpacked, the moment I committed to staying and trying again, he'd flip. He'd go right back to telling me he didn't love me, that he didn't want me there, that I was a burden he never asked for. I tried to reach out to my family. I was desperate. I needed someone to pull me out of the deep end, to give me a reason to stay away. But they wouldn't help. He even had the audacity to complain about them, saying they were bad family for not supporting me, all while he was the one making my life a living hell. It felt like he wanted me to be angry at them, so that he would be the only person I had left. When my aunt finally started to change her mind, when it looked like she might actually help me get away, he called her during one of our arguments. I don't know what he said to her, but whatever it was, it worked. She went back on her offer. She pulled the ladder up, and I was left at the bottom of the pit again. He denied having anything to do with it, of course. He went right back to being angry with her and the rest of my family, playing the part of the supportive partner who was just as frustrated as I was. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Last year, he started volunteering and going to a class. At first, he invited me to come along. I went because, honestly, I had nothing else. I was in a foreign country, I had no friends, and he had stopped taking me anywhere else. I thought it might be a way for us to bond. But then the script flipped again. He started complaining that he needed space. He said he wanted to go to his classes alone. When I told him, "Fine, I'll stay back and give you that space," he got angry. He told me he didn't actually want space and that he only said it because we had been arguing. He was keeping me off balance on purpose, making sure I never knew which version of him I was going to get. When we went to America last year, the cycle reached a fever pitch. During one particularly nasty argument, he threatened to leave me right there, thousands of miles from home. I was terrified. I told him I'd stay back, that I'd find a way to make it on my own since he clearly didn't want me. And what did he do? He begged me to stay. He promised that things would change. He swore he'd stop using his mother as a weapon against me, swore he'd stop being glued to his phone, and promised we'd start going places together again. He offered to do whatever it took to rebuild trust. He even offered to turn his GPS location on 24/7 so I could see where he was at all times. I didn't even ask for it. He volunteered it. But even with the location on, the behavior didn't stop. He was still acting suspicious, still hiding his screen, still slipping away. And when I'd ask about it, he'd explode. "My location is on. How could I be doing anything?" He used the very tool he gave me to build trust as a shield to keep me from questioning the truth. Eventually, he started complaining about the location sharing, calling it invasive and controlling, even though it was his idea. He started acting like I was a prison warden and he was the innocent inmate. The irritation in his eyes when he looked at me became a permanent fixture. He'd complain that I was always here, that he woke up to me and went to bed with me every night like it was a curse. He started attacking my interests. If I showed him a video I liked or talked about a hobby, he'd shut me down instantly. "I'm not interested in that," he'd say. "I'm a man." Then, an hour later, he'd backtrack and say he was interested, only to snap again the next day. I tried to have a simple conversation, and he'd just stare at me and say, "I have nothing to talk to you about. We spend too much time together." The walls were closing in, and I was starting to realize that the space he wanted wasn't just physical. He was trying to push me out of his mind entirely. It's a strange feeling, living in a house where you're treated like a ghost that refuses to leave. We were residing with his parents, which added this whole other layer of suffocation to the situation. You'd think that in a house full of people, the tension would dissipate, but it only made the silence between us louder. He used to tell me that he didn't mind being around me all the time. He used to say that with anyone else he'd get fed up, but with me, it was different. He made me feel special, like I was the one exception to his rules. But that version of him was dead and gone. Now, it seemed like his goal in life was to make sure I knew exactly how much of a burden I was. The passive aggressiveness started to leak into everything. He wouldn't just say he was annoyed. He'd let it build up like steam in a pressure cooker until he finally exploded over the smallest things. One afternoon, he had an appointment at the dentist. He actually agreed to let me come along, and we had planned to go somewhere together afterward. It felt like a win, a tiny, fragile bit of normalcy. But later that night, the mask slipped. He turned to me, his eyes cold, and accused me of only going with him so I could spy on him. He took a nice moment and twisted it into something ugly, making me feel like a stalker for simply being present in his life. Then there were the post office runs. I started noticing a pattern. I'd wake up and he'd already be dressed, hovering near the door, looking jumpy. He'd tell me he was just heading to the post office. But the moment I'd say, "Oh, wait, I'll come with you," or if I happened to already be awake and ready to go, he'd immediately lose interest. He'd huff, take off his shoes, and go back to bed. It was so transparent, it was almost insulting. He wasn't going to the post office. He was looking for a window of time where I wasn't watching him. He was looking for an exit. The most painful part was how he started using his mother against me. He'd come back from talking to her and tell me, "My mum says all our problems are because we're together too much. She says we need space." He was hiding behind her skirts, using her words to validate his own cruelty. And yet, when I would actually try to give him that space, when I would go into another room or stay quiet, he'd find a way to make that my fault too. I remember one specific night. He had bought an old PS3 and was obsessed with fixing it. For days he sat there, tinkering with it, completely lost in his own world. I tried to be supportive. I even went and got food for both of us, thinking I was being helpful. But when I brought it to him, he didn't say thank you. He looked at me like I had just interrupted the most important meeting of his life. He snapped at me, complaining that he didn't get any uninterrupted breaks. Think about that for a second. He had been sitting there for hours, doing exactly what he wanted, and the mere act of me bringing him dinner was considered an interruption. It all came to a head a couple of nights ago. He had gone to his class, and when he came back, things actually seemed okay for a moment. We made dinner together. He asked me to show him some of the videos I'd been watching during the day. We were talking, laughing a little, and for a split second, I allowed myself to breathe. I thought, okay, maybe we're okay. We decided to put on a show we'd been following, but as the show started, I realised I'd forgotten my glasses. I paused it to go grab them. Then I had to get up again to get settled. I'll admit, I paused it a few times in those first 10 minutes, but I was in physical pain that night. My back was flaring up and I was struggling to get comfortable. I asked him, as gently as I could, if he would mind refilling my water bottle. I had asked him earlier and he'd said yes, but he hadn't done it. He snapped. "I don't remember saying that," he yelled. He told me he didn't want to go downstairs. I suggested he just use the kettle we had right there in the room, but even that was too much. He didn't want to get up. He didn't want to help. Instead, he launched into a tirade about how many times I had paused the show. He told me he didn't have a chance to relax, that there was too much talking, and that he was overwhelmed by having to talk to me after talking all day in his class. It was like a physical blow. He had just spent the last hour telling me he enjoyed our conversation, only to turn around and weaponize it against me the moment I asked for a glass of water. It became clear that he didn't enjoy our time together at all. He was just performing, waiting for the moment he could stop pretending and go back to his cold, distant reality. I told him it sounded like he resented me. I told him it felt like he was only spending time with me because he felt like he had to, not because he wanted to. And instead of denying it, instead of reassuring me, he just doubled down. He went right back to the space argument. He told me he wanted to be able to go to the grocery store alone. He wanted to be able to leave the room for hours on end. He made it sound like I was a ball and chain wrapped around his ankle. The reality is, he already had that space. He played games alone. He watched his own shows. We really only spent time together late at night. But for him, it wasn't enough. He wanted me to exist in a different dimension until he decided he needed something from me. And that's when the darkest thought started to take root. Why does a man who claims to love you, who begs you not to leave every time you pack a bag, treat you like a nuisance the rest of the time? Why does he want space so badly, yet refuse to let you go home? I started watching him closer. I noticed how his face would light up whenever I mentioned not going somewhere with him, only for that light to vanish the moment I changed my mind. I saw the relief in his eyes at the prospect of being away from me. It wasn't just space he wanted. He was hiding something. Or someone. He keeps insisting he loves me. He keeps talking about a future together. But how can you have a future with someone who can't even stand to refill your water bottle without starting a fight? How can you have a future with someone who sees your presence as a prison sentence? I feel like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff, and he's the one who pushed me there. But he's also the only one holding my hand, telling me he'll never let me fall. But I can see his fingers slipping. I can see that he's tired of holding on. And the scariest part? I think he's already looking at the view without me. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind, or if he was just incredibly good at making me feel like I was. You see, when someone tells you they have a clinical obsession with how unattractive they find you, it does something to your soul. It's not just a mean comment you can brush off. He framed it as a medical condition. It was his OCD. By calling it that, he turned his cruelty into a symptom, something I wasn't allowed to be angry about. If I got upset, I was being insensitive to his mental health. If I cried, I was making it all about me. He had effectively built a cage out of his own insecurities and locked me inside it. The silence in his parents' house became my only companion. Have you ever been in a room with someone and felt more alone than if you were actually by yourself? That was my life every single day. I'd be sitting just a few feet away from him, and I could practically feel the waves of resentment radiating off him. He'd be on his laptop, his face illuminated by that cold, flickering light, and if I so much as breathed too loudly, he'd stiffen. It was like I was a glitch in his perfect, solitary world. And then there were the bathroom trips. I know it sounds like a small, almost silly thing to focus on, but in a relationship built on shadows, the small things are where the truth hides. He started spending hours in there. He'd take his phone, lock the door, and just disappear. I'd sit in the bedroom, listening to the silence of the hallway, wondering who he was talking to. What was so captivating on that screen that he'd rather sit on a bathroom floor than be in the same room as the woman he supposedly begged to stay? When I'd finally work up the courage to ask him about it, the explosion was instantaneous. "I can't even go to the bathroom in peace," he'd scream. "You're so controlling. You're suffocating me." He had this incredible talent for taking a valid concern and flipping it until I was the one apologizing. He'd make me feel like a monster for noticing that my boyfriend spent 4 hours a day behind a locked door. But the most confusing part, the part that kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling, was the location sharing. He had offered it up like a peace treaty. "Look," he had said. I'll turn my location on 24/7. You'll always know where I am. That way you'll know you can trust me. And for a while, I tried to let that be enough. But location doesn't tell you who someone is texting. It doesn't tell you who they're thinking about when they're looking right at you with dead eyes. He used that GPS coordinate like a weapon. Whenever I'd mention his distance or his weird behavior, he'd just shove his phone in my face. My location is on, see? I'm right here. How could I be cheating if I'm right here? It was the ultimate gaslight. He was physically present, but emotionally, he had moved out months ago. He was using the transparency of the app to hide the absolute lack of transparency in his heart. I remember one morning specifically. I had woken up early, something I rarely did because my depression made the bed feel like the only safe place on earth. I heard the floorboards creak. I peeked out and saw him, already dressed, creeping toward the door. "Where are you going?" I whispered, my voice thick with sleep. He jumped, his shoulders hitting his ears. "Just the post office," he snapped, his voice sharp with irritation. "I told you I had errands." "I'll come with you," I said, starting to sit up. I could use the fresh air. The change in his energy was terrifying. He didn't say okay. He didn't say great. He just stopped. He stood there for a beat, his back to me, and then he started unbuttoning his coat. "Never mind," he muttered, tossing his keys on the dresser. "I don't even want to go anymore. You just ruined the mood." He went back to bed and pulled the covers over his head, leaving me sitting there in the grey morning light, wondering what mood is required to go to the post office. It was becoming so obvious. He didn't want space. He wanted a life that didn't include me. He wanted the freedom to be whoever he was when I wasn't looking, but he wanted the security of knowing I was still there, waiting for him, whenever he decided he was bored. I tried to talk to him about our togetherness. He always claimed we were together 24/7, but the reality was that we were just two people sharing oxygen. We didn't go on dates. We didn't have deep conversations. We didn't even eat together half the time. He started criticizing my interests, telling me that the things I cared about were stupid, or that he wasn't interested because he was a man. It was a bizarre, patriarchal wall he suddenly decided to build. He'd spend hours watching his own things, but the moment I tried to share a piece of myself with him, he'd shut me down. "I have nothing to talk about with you," he'd say, "because we're always together. It's a special kind of torture to be told that your presence is the reason your partner has nothing to say to you." It made me feel like I was a vacuum, sucking the life out of him just by existing. I started to shrink. I stopped talking about my day. I stopped showing him things I thought were funny. I became as quiet as possible, trying to be the space he claimed he needed, even while I was standing right in front of him. But even my silence wasn't enough. He started bringing his mother into it. He'd tell me about conversations they had, conversations where I was the villain. "My mum thinks you're too needy," he'd say. "She thinks it's weird that you want to go everywhere with me." He was using her to validate his neglect. It wasn't just him who found me burdensome anymore. It was his whole family. Or at least, that's what he wanted me to believe. I felt like I was in a house of mirrors, and every reflection showed me a version of myself that was uglier, crazier, and more desperate than the last. I was trapped in a foreign country, with no money, no family support, and a man who told me he didn't love me every time we had a disagreement. And yet, every time I reached for my suitcase, he'd transform. The coldness would melt away, replaced by a desperate, sobbing plea for me to stay. "I need you," he'd cry. "I can't do this without you. I promise I'll change." It was a cycle I couldn't break. I was addicted to the 5 minutes of good he'd give me after 3 weeks of bad. I was starving, and he was throwing me crumbs and calling it a feast. I didn't realize that a man who truly loves you doesn't make you beg for a glass of water. And he certainly doesn't make you feel like a criminal for wanting to be part of his life. I was starting to see the cracks in his story, though. The post office trips, the bathroom phone sessions, the sudden, overwhelming feeling whenever we actually spent time together. It was all leading somewhere. I just didn't know if I was ready to see what was at the end of the road. The most exhausting part of being with him wasn't the yelling. It was the way he made me feel like a project he had grown tired of working on. Everything we did together, every meal we shared, every show we watched, started to feel like a chore to him. Have you ever been in a room with someone and realized that they are physically there, but mentally they are checking their watch, waiting for the moment they can escape? That was my life. I was a scheduled obligation in a calendar he didn't want to keep. He started developing this bizarre, gendered war between us. I'd try to show him something I was passionate about, a video, an article, a piece of art, and he'd look at it with this blank, dead stare. "I'm just not interested in that," he'd say, his voice flat. "I'm a man." It was such a strange, archaic thing to say, as if being a man meant he was biologically incapable of caring about anything I found interesting. He'd spend hours immersed in his own world, but the second I asked for an ounce of shared interest, I was met with a no that felt like a door slamming in my face. And yet, the moment he thought I was actually going to leave, the man who couldn't be bothered to look at a YouTube video with me would vanish, replaced by a sobbing boy who needed me to survive. It was a psychological whiplash that left me dizzy. One day, he had a dentist appointment. He'd been complaining about his teeth, and I offered to go with him. We even made plans to go somewhere nice afterward, a rare attempt at a date. He agreed. He seemed fine with it. But later that night, after we'd come home, the atmosphere shifted. I could see it in the way he walked, the way he set his keys down. The storm was coming. "You only went with me today to spy on me, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. I was stunned. "Spy on you? We were going to the dentist. We had a nice afternoon." "No," he sneered. "You went because you don't trust me. You went to keep tabs on me." He took a memory that I was trying to hold on to as a good day and lit it on fire. He made me feel like a stalker for simply existing in his presence. It was a classic move. Accuse the other person of the very thing you're doing. He was the one hiding things, so he assumed I must be too. He was the one with the secrets, so he projected that onto me until I started to question my own reality. Was I spying? Was I being too much? I began to shrink even further, trying to take up as little space as possible so he'd have no reason to be angry. But the smaller I got, the more he complained about how big my presence was. He started saying things like, "I wake up to you and go to bed with you every night. It's too much. I have no room to breathe." Think about how that feels. To be told by your partner that waking up next to you is a burden. I had moved across an ocean for this man. I had no one else. And he was telling me that my very existence in his room was a cage. I tried to give him the space he claimed to crave. I'd stay in bed while he went to his classes or his volunteering. But then the script would flip again. If I stayed back, he'd accuse me of being depressed or unmotivated. If I went with him, I was suffocating him. There was no winning. It was a game where the rules changed every 10 minutes, and the only goal was for me to lose. I remember a specific incident when he was heading out to his class. I had originally said I was going to stay home, and I saw his face, just for a split second. He looked relieved. He looked excited. But then, at the last minute, I changed my mind. I was lonely, and the thought of sitting in that house with his parents all day was more than I could handle. "Actually," I said, "wait up. I'll come with you." The light in his eyes didn't just go out. It turned into a glare. He didn't say anything, but the way he gripped his bag, the way he sighed, it was like I had just told him I was going to follow him into the shower. He didn't want me there, and it wasn't because he needed space to study. It was because he wanted the freedom to be someone else when I wasn't around. The suspicion of cheating wasn't just a nagging feeling anymore. It was a roar. Every time he went to the grocery store and came back hours later with one bag of milk. Every time he needed a break and vanished into another room for 3 hours with his phone. I started to see the pattern. He wasn't looking for space from a relationship. He was looking for space from me so he could pursue other relationships. And yet, whenever I brought it up, he would use the location sharing as his ultimate shield. How could I be cheating? You can see exactly where I am. He was right. I could see where he was, but I couldn't see who he was talking to. I couldn't see the messages he was deleting. I couldn't see the way his eyes lit up when his phone buzzed, a light that never appeared when I spoke to him. He was using the GPS as a digital alibi while he emotionally moved on right in front of me. He started telling me to go home. He'd get into these rages and scream at me to just pack my things and go back to my family. But my family wouldn't help me. He knew that. He had seen to it. He'd talk about how bad they were for not supporting me, all while he was the one making me feel like I had no choice but to stay. It was the ultimate isolation. He had cut the ropes that connected me to the rest of the world, and now he was complaining that I was clinging to the only person left, him. "Why did you beg me to come back?" I asked him once, after a particularly cruel argument where he told me he didn't want me there. He just shrugged, his face a mask of indifference. "I didn't force you," he said. "It was your choice to come back. Don't blame me for your decisions." The gaslighting was complete. He had begged, pleaded, and promised the world to get me to stay. And the moment I did, he rewrote history. In his mind, I was the one who was forcing myself on him. I was the one who was refusing to leave. He had managed to make himself the victim of my neediness, while I was the one living in a foreign country with no one to turn to. I started to feel like I was disappearing. I'd look in the mirror and barely recognize the woman staring back. I had lost the weight. I had changed my clothes. I had tried to be everything he wanted, and it still wasn't enough. He had told me he had a clinical obsession with my lack of attractiveness, and even as I became the healthy weight he claimed to want, the goalposts just moved. Now, it wasn't my body that was the problem, it was my soul. It was my anxiety. It was my presence. I was waiting for the final blow. I knew it was coming. You can only live in a house of cards for so long before the wind picks up. And the wind was starting to howl. I began to feel like my very existence was a series of interruptions in a life he was trying to live without me. It's one thing to be ignored. It's another thing entirely to be treated like a fly buzzing around someone's head, something to be swatted away, an annoyance that just won't take the hint. I was living in his parents' house, thousands of miles from my own support system, and the man I had sacrificed everything for was looking at me like I was a stain on his carpet. The way he spoke to me had shifted from cold to downright degrading. I remember just a few days ago I was trying to share something with him, just a small piece of my day, a video I'd found interesting. He didn't just say he wasn't interested. He looked me in the eye and told me he didn't want to see my ST. That was the word he used. My interests, my thoughts, the things that made me me. It was all just ST to him. He'd backtrack later, of course. He'd say he was just angry over something else, and that he didn't mean it. But you can't unring a bell like that. You can't take back the look of pure, unadulterated boredom he had when I tried to speak. He told me he didn't have anything to talk about, because we were together too much. Think about the logic in that. Because we shared a room, we supposedly had nothing to say. I had a million things I wanted to say. I wanted to talk about our future, about our problems, about the world outside those four walls. But he had checked out. He was saving his words for someone else. I knew he was. I could feel it in the way he guarded his phone like it was a holy relic. He'd stay up until 3 or 4 in the morning, the light from his screen casting long, eerie shadows across the room. If I woke up and asked what he was doing, he'd snap at me for spying or monitoring him. He'd say he was just relaxing or unwinding from the stress of his class. But who needs to unwind for 6 hours in the middle of the night? And then there were the mornings. I'd wake up and the bed would be cold. I'd find him already up, hovering by the door, looking like he'd been caught doing something wrong. "I'm going to the post office," he'd mutter, not meeting my eyes. It was always the post office, or the grocery store, or a walk. But the second I'd say, "Wait, let me get my shoes, I'll come with," he'd suddenly change his mind. The errand wasn't important anymore. He'd take off his coat, climb back into bed, and go silent for the rest of the day. It was so obvious it hurt. He was looking for windows of time where I wasn't there. He was looking for moments of freedom from the woman he had begged to stay. He wanted the title of a boyfriend without any of the responsibilities. He wanted me to be there when he was lonely or needed a chore done, but he wanted me to vanish the moment someone more interesting lit up his screen. He started complaining about my family again too. My aunt, specifically. He seemed obsessed with the fact that they weren't helping me. "Doesn't it make you angry?" he'd ask, his voice sharp with a strange kind of agitation. "Don't you hate them for leaving you here?" He seemed to want me to be as miserable and isolated as he felt. He wanted me to burn every bridge I had left so that I would be truly, completely stuck with him. It was a terrifying realization. He was angry that I wasn't more angry. He was fueled by conflict, and when I wouldn't give it to him, he'd manufacture it. We were together 24/7, according to him. That was his favourite defence. Whenever I'd say I felt lonely, he'd point to the fact that we were in the same room. "We're together right now. What more do you want?" But being in the same room as someone who is actively ignoring you is a special kind of loneliness. It's a vacuum that sucks the air out of your lungs. I'd be sitting right there, and he'd be playing a game or watching a video with his earbuds in, completely unreachable. If I tried to talk to him, he'd sigh, that heavy, theatrical sigh, and tell me I was interrupting his break. His whole life was a break. He didn't work. He went to a class a few times a week and volunteered. The rest of the time, he was relaxing. And yet, he made me feel like asking for 10 minutes of his time was like asking him to climb Mount Everest. The water bottle incident still played on a loop in my head. I was in pain. I was struggling to get comfortable, and I asked for a simple refill. He had said yes earlier, then forgot, and then got angry that I even asked. "I don't want to go downstairs," he'd said. It wasn't about the water. It was about the fact that doing anything for me, anything at all, was an imposition. I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome, even though he was the one who had sent the invitation. He started telling me he needed to be in another room alone for a few hours every day. He said he wanted to go to the store alone, to go to his classes alone, to exist in a world where I didn't. And look, I understand the need for space. Everyone does. But when you already spend most of your day doing exactly what you want, and your partner is a stranger in a foreign land who only sees you for an hour at night, asking for more space is just a polite way of saying, "I don't want you here." I started to suspect that the space wasn't for him to be alone. It was for him to be with someone else. I'd see him get relieved whenever I mentioned not going somewhere. His whole posture would relax. He'd become almost nice for a few minutes, fueled by the excitement of my absence. But the moment I'd change my mind, the moment I'd say, "Actually, I'll go with you," the mask would fall. He'd become irritable, snappy, and cold. He was leading a double life, and I was the obstacle in the middle of it. He'd tell me he loved me, tell me he wanted a future, and then treat me like a nuisance. He'd beg me not to leave, then scream at me to go home. He was keeping me on a leash, making sure I was close enough to control, but far enough away that I didn't interfere with whatever he was doing on that phone. I felt like I was waiting for a bomb to go off. The tension in that house, in that room, was becoming unbearable. I was losing my mind, losing my self-esteem, and losing my grip on what a real relationship was supposed to look like. I was a ghost, haunting a man who had already moved on, and I didn't know how to stop the haunting. I didn't know how to leave, and I didn't know how to stay. I was just there, waiting for the final no, waiting for the truth to finally claw its way out of the shadows. The silence in that house didn't just feel like a lack of noise. It felt like a presence, a heavy, suffocating weight that sat on my chest every time I opened my eyes. We were living with his parents, and you would think that being in a house full of people would make the isolation less intense, but it actually made it worse. It turned our bedroom into a pressurized chamber where every sigh, every look, and every whispered argument felt like it was being amplified by 1,000. I felt like I was living in a cage within a cage, and the person who held the key was the one telling me I was the reason he couldn't breathe. He had this way of weaponizing the very things he should have been protecting. He knew about my social anxiety. He knew about my history with my weight and how much I had struggled to feel comfortable in my own skin. When we were online, he was my biggest cheerleader. He was the one who said he'd never judge me, that he'd be the last person to ever make me feel less than. But the moment I was physically there, within his reach, that acceptance turned into a scalpel. He used it to pick me apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but my insecurities. The OCD comment, the claim that he had a clinical obsession with how much my body repulsed him, was the cruelest thing anyone has ever said to me. But he didn't stop there. Even after I lost the weight, even after I reached what he called a healthy size and changed the way I dressed to please him, he still found ways to keep me at a distance. He'd tell me, "If you looked like this when we first met, I would have been all over you." It was a twisted, psychological game. He was telling me I was finally good enough for his desire, but then he'd immediately withdraw it, claiming his medication had killed his libido. He was dangling the carrot of his affection in front of me, and then whipping me with the stick of his rejection the moment I tried to reach for it. And then there was his mother. He started using her as a proxy for his own cruelty. He'd spend hours downstairs with her, and when he finally came back up to our room, he wouldn't bring comfort or a, "Hey, I missed you." He'd bring a list of my failures. "My mum thinks our issues are because you're too needy," he'd say. "She says we're together too much." He was hiding behind her, using her words to validate the fact that he was ignoring me. It made me feel like the entire household was whispering about me, like I was the problem they were all trying to solve. I tried to talk to him about it. I tried to explain that being in the same room isn't the same as spending time together. I'd say, "We haven't actually spoken in 3 days." And he'd look at me with this exhausted, bored expression. "What are you talking about? I'm right here. We're together 24/7. You're just never satisfied." It's a terrifying thing to have someone look you in the face and deny your reality. He was physically present, but emotionally, he was 1,000 miles away, and he was gaslighting me into believing that his proximity was the same as his love. The incidents with the PS3 and the uninterrupted breaks were the turning point for me. He had bought this old console and spent days, literal days, sitting in front of it, tinkering with it, completely lost in his own world. I didn't complain, I didn't nag, I even went and got food for both of us, trying to be a good partner. But when I brought it to him, he didn't say thank you. He looked at me like I was a telemarketer calling him during dinner. He snapped that he didn't get any uninterrupted breaks. Think about the math of that. He had spent the entire day doing exactly what he wanted. He hadn't worked, he hadn't cleaned, he hadn't even looked at me. And yet, the 30 seconds it took for me to bring him a meal was considered an interruption. I realized then that to him, I wasn't a partner. I was a job. I was a task he had to complete, an obligation he was trying to minimize. That's why he wanted space. Not because he needed to clear his head, and not because we were together too much. He wanted space because he wanted the freedom to be the version of himself that didn't have to deal with me. He wanted to go to the post office alone. He wanted to go to the grocery store alone. And whenever I mentioned not going with him, I saw it, the flash of relief in his eyes. It was like a weight was being lifted off him the moment he thought he wouldn't have to look at me for an hour. But the second I changed my mind, the second I said, "Actually, I'll go," that relief would turn into pure, unadulterated resentment. He'd huff, he'd roll his eyes, or he'd just cancelled the trip entirely. It made me realise that his errands weren't just errands, they were his escapes. And I was the one who was ruining them just by wanting to be near him. I started looking at his behaviour through a different lens. The way he stayed up all night on his phone, the way he'd vanish into the bathroom for hours, the way he accused me of spying on him when I went to the dentist. It all pointed to one thing. He wasn't looking for space to be alone. He was looking for space to be with someone else. Whether it was a physical person or just someone on the other end of an encrypted app, he was building a life that didn't include me. He was just waiting for the right moment to finally kick the chair out from under me. He kept telling me he loved me. He kept talking about a future. But those words felt like empty shells. He was saying them because he knew they were the only things keeping me from packing my bags and leaving for good. He was keeping me on a leash, making sure I was close enough to control, but far enough away that I didn't see the truth. I felt like I was trapped in a psychological thriller, and I was the only one who didn't know the ending. I was waiting for the final piece of the puzzle to fall into place, for the space he wanted to finally become the distance between us that could never be closed. I was losing myself, disappearing into the shadows of a relationship that had become a ghost story. And the most terrifying part? I think he was already haunting someone else. The trip to America was supposed to be a turning point, a chance to breathe air that wasn't thick with the resentment of his parents' house. But instead, it became a masterclass in psychological warfare. Imagine being thousands of miles from home, in a country where you have absolutely no one, and the person who is supposed to be your anchor looks at you during an argument and says, "I'm leaving you here. I'm going to the airport, and you can figure out the rest on your own." The sheer cold terror of that moment is something I'll never forget. I was standing in a hotel room, clutching my phone like a lifeline, realizing that I was completely at his mercy. I told him, "Fine, if you hate me this much, I'll stay. I'll find a way to make it on my own." I was bluffing, of course. I had no money and nowhere to go. But I was so tired of being the one who always begged. And then, like a switch had been flipped, the monster vanished. He crumpled. He started sobbing, telling me he didn't mean it, that he was just stressed, and that he couldn't imagine his life without me. He made these grand, sweeping promises. He told me he'd stop using his mother as a weapon. He promised he'd put the phone down. He said we'd start going places together, that he'd actually try to be a partner again. He even offered to turn on his location 24/7, a gesture he called the ultimate proof of innocence. I believed him because I had to. When you're drowning, you don't critique the person throwing you a rope, even if you know they're the one who pushed you in. But once we got back, the changes, he promised, were nothing more than a new coat of paint on a rotting house. He kept the location sharing on, sure, but he used it as a shield. Every time I noticed him acting weird or sneaking off to another room, he'd bark at me, "Check the app, I'm right here. You're just being controlling and abusive again." He had taken a tool meant for trust and turned it into a gag to keep me from asking questions. I started to notice a new, terrifying pattern. He wasn't just avoiding me. He was becoming physically repulsed by my presence. He'd complain about how I was always there, that he woke up to my face and went to sleep to my face, and that it was too much. He talked about it like I was a parasite he couldn't shake off. He started criticizing my interests again, telling me he wasn't interested in the things I liked because he was a man, a phrase he used like a get-out-of-jail-free card for being a jerk. I tried to have a simple conversation with him, just a, "How was your day?" or a comment about something I'd read, and he'd look at me with such profound boredom that it felt like he was counting the seconds until I'd stop talking. "I have nothing to talk about with you," he'd say. "We're together too much." The logic was so flawed it made my head spin. We weren't together. We were two people sharing a zip code and an occasional Netflix password. But in his mind, my physical proximity was a debt I was forcing him to pay. Then came the dentist incident. He had agreed to let me come with him to his appointment so we could go somewhere together afterward. It felt like a tiny victory, a moment of normal couple behavior. But the second we got home, the mask fell. He accused me of spying on him. He said I only went because I didn't trust him. He took a memory I was trying to save and turned it into a crime scene. It was becoming clear that he was desperate for space, but only a very specific kind of space. He wanted the space to be the post office guy. That's what I started calling it in my head. He'd wake up early, look around shiftily, and say he was headed to the post office. But if I offered to come, or if I was already awake, he'd immediately cancel the trip. He'd huff, take off his shoes, and crawl back into bed like a teenager who'd been caught sneaking out. The message was loud and clear. He didn't want to go to the post office. He wanted to go somewhere where I wasn't. And then there was the way he'd look at me when I mentioned not going somewhere. I remember a few times I briefly told him I wouldn't go to his class with him, or I'd stay home while he went to the store. The relief on his face was almost beautiful. He looked like a man who had just been granted a stay of execution. He'd be almost nice to me for those few minutes, fueled by the pure joy of my absence. But the moment I changed my mind, the moment I'd say, "Actually, you know what? I'll come after all," his face would drop into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He didn't want space to be alone. He wanted space to be without me. He started staying up all night on his phone again, the blue light reflecting in his eyes like a digital ghost. He'd stay in the bathroom for hours, or sneak into another room the second I fell asleep. He claimed it was to not wake me up, but he'd never cared about that before. He was hiding. He was living a life in the shadows, a life that only existed in the hours between midnight and dawn when I wasn't there to witness it. He told me he loved me. He told me he wanted a future. But he treated me like an intruder in his life. He'd beg me not to leave, then scream at me to go home to my family. The family he knew wouldn't take me in. He had effectively isolated me in a foreign land, and now he was complaining that I was too close to him. The water bottle argument was the final piece of the puzzle. I was in pain, I was struggling, and he couldn't even be bothered to refill a bottle of water without making it about his lack of relaxation. He saw my needs as an interruption to his uninterrupted breaks. Breaks from what? He didn't work. He didn't clean. His whole life was a break. And yet, I was the one who was overwhelming him. I realized that he didn't resent me because I was needy. He resented me because I was a witness. I was a witness to his lies, his laziness, and his suspicious behavior. As long as I was there, he had to pretend to be a boyfriend, and he was clearly getting tired of the performance. He wanted space, and I was starting to realize that the only way he'd ever truly be happy was if that space was miles wide and didn't include me at all. But he was too cowardly to end it. He wanted me to be the one to leave so he could play the victim. He wanted to push me until I broke so he could tell his mother and his friends that I was the crazy one who couldn't handle the relationship. He was building a cage for me. but he was calling it a home. And the most terrifying part was that I was starting to forget what the outside world even looked like. I was becoming as small as he wanted me to be, a ghost in the background of his life, waiting for the moment he finally decided to stop pretending I existed at all. Living in his parents' house was like living in a museum, where I was the only exhibit nobody wanted to see. I'd walk down the hallway and the air would practically curdle. His mother, the woman he'd use as a shield during every argument, was always there, a silent judge in the background of our misery. He'd spend hours downstairs with her, and I'd stay in our room, staring at the walls, feeling like an intruder in a life I had moved across an ocean to build. When he'd finally come back up, he wouldn't bring warmth. He'd bring the coldness of their conversations, telling me how everyone agreed that I was the problem. The most twisted part of this entire ordeal was the way he handled my family. I was desperate to get out. I was at the end of my rope, reaching out to anyone who would listen. I finally got through to my aunt. For a moment, it felt like the clouds were parting. She was going to help me. She was going to be my ticket home. But then, the unthinkable happened. During one of our screaming matches, one of those nights where he was telling me he didn't love me and wanted me gone, he picked up the phone. He called her. I don't know what kind of poison he dripped into her ear. I don't know what version of the truth he sold her. But whatever it was, it worked. My aunt, the one person who was supposed to be my lifeline, suddenly went silent. She took back her offer. She retracted the help. And the sickest part? He came back to me and complained about it. He had the audacity to say, "Your family is terrible. They should always help you because they're family." He was the one who had cut the rope, and then he stood on the edge of the cliff and mocked me for falling. He wanted me trapped. He wanted me to have nowhere else to go so that he could treat me however he wanted without the fear of me actually leaving. It was a hostage situation disguised as a relationship. He'd tell me to go home, knowing full well I couldn't. And when I'd ask, "Then why did you beg me to come back? Why did you cry at the airport? Why did you promise me things would change?" He'd just shrug. "That was your choice," he'd say, his voice devoid of any emotion. "I didn't force you to stay. You're here because you want to be." It was the ultimate gaslight. He had spent years breaking down my self-esteem, isolating me from my friends, and sabotaging my relationship with my family, only to turn around and tell me that my presence was a voluntary choice I was making to annoy him. And then there was the medication. He started taking these pills that he claimed killed his libido, and he used them as a permanent "do not disturb" sign. He'd tell me he had OCD about how much he didn't find me attractive, and then he'd point to the pills as the reason he couldn't even hold my hand. But I started to notice things. I started to notice how he'd stay up all night, the light from his laptop screen reflecting in his eyes with an intensity that didn't look like low libido to me. He was engaged with something. He was passionate about something. It just wasn't me. I remember one night specifically. We were supposed to watch something together, one of those rare together moments he used to defend himself. He said he was going to get a drink and would be right back. I waited. And waited. I finally went looking for him and found him in the living room. He was sprawled out on the couch, his eyes closed, breathing deeply. He was pretending to be asleep. But his phone was right there, face down on his chest, still warm to the touch. I knew he had just been on it. I knew he was awake. I called him out on it. I told him how suspicious it was, how much it looked like he was hiding something. And he didn't even open his eyes at first. He just let out a long, weary sigh and said, "You're so crazy. You're so controlling. I can't even sleep without you thinking I'm cheating." He had turned my intuition into a mental illness. Every time I caught him in a lie, every time I noticed a discrepancy in his story, it was my anxiety talking. It was my insecurity. He had me convinced that the problem wasn't his behavior, but my reaction to it. The 24/7 argument was his favorite shield. We're together all the time. How could I be cheating? But we weren't together. He was in his world of video games, uninterrupted breaks, and bathroom phone sessions, and I was in mine, a world of silence and shrinking self-worth. He'd wake up hours before me, sneaking out of the room like a thief, and when I'd ask where he went, he'd claim he was just trying to be quiet. But he'd never cared about noise before. He was looking for gaps in the day where he could be someone else. I'd see the relief on his face when I said I wasn't going to his class. He'd practically skip out the door. But if I said, "Actually, wait, I'll go," he'd stop in his tracks. His whole body would stiffen, and he'd look at me with such pure resentment that it felt like a physical blow. He didn't want space to study or volunteer. He wanted space to be the man he was when I wasn't watching, the man who didn't have a clinical obsession with being repulsed by his partner. The irony was that he was the one who had accused me of cheating when we were long distance. He was the one who had backups and replacements on the brain. He was projecting his own guilt onto me for years, and now that we were in the same house, he was using that same projection to keep me off balance. I felt like I was living with a stranger who happened to know all my secrets. He knew exactly which buttons to push to make me feel small. He knew exactly how to use his mother, my family, and my own body against me. And the most terrifying part was that he still insisted he loved me. He still talked about a future together, about buying a house, about a life that didn't involve this constant warfare. But a future with him felt like a death sentence. It felt like an endless loop of bathroom trips, post office runs, and uninterrupted breaks from a woman who was already barely there. I was a ghost in his parents' house, waiting for the person who had created me to finally let me go. But he wouldn't. He wanted his ghost right where he could see her, just as long as she didn't talk, didn't ask questions, and didn't expect to be loved. The most chilling part of it all wasn't the yelling or the coldness. It was the excitement. It's a sound I'll never forget, the lightness in his voice when he thought he was finally going to be rid of me for an hour. I'd tell him, "I think I'll stay back from your class today," or "I'm not feeling up to the grocery store trip." And his entire aura would transform. He'd become almost charming, almost like the man I met online years ago. He'd be attentive, quick with a smile, practically ushering me toward the bed to rest. But it was a lie. He wasn't happy that I was resting. He was happy that he was free. The moment I'd change my mind, the second I'd say, "Actually, you know what? I feel a bit better. I'll come with you." The mask wouldn't just slip. It would shatter. His face would go grey with resentment. He'd stand by the door, his hand white-knuckled on the handle, and look at me with such pure, concentrated vitriol that I'd feel it like a physical weight in my chest. He didn't want my company. He didn't want us. He wanted the version of his life where I was a ghost who stayed in her room and didn't witness the things he was doing. I can't help but think that all this space he's been begging for isn't for his mental health. It's not for his OCD, and it's not because we're together 24/7. It's for her, or them, or whoever is on the other end of that phone he hides in the bathroom and guards in the middle of the night. He wants the space to cheat. He wants the space to build a life with someone else while keeping me in reserve as his emotional punching bag. He still looks me in the eye and tells me he loves me. He still talks about our future like it's a real thing, a house we're going to buy, a life we're going to lead. But how can you have a future with someone who treats your presence like a prison sentence? How can you build a life with a man who sees your need for a glass of water as an interruption of his peace? I'm still here, in this house, in this country where I have no one. I'm still listening to him tell me that I'm crazy for noticing the patterns, that I'm controlling, for wanting to spend time with my own partner. I'm a ghost in a foreign land, haunted by the man who claimed he'd be the only one to ever truly accept me. But I'm starting to see the truth now. He didn't accept me because he loved me. He accepted me because he thought I'd be easy to break. He saw my anxiety, my weight, and my loneliness, and he saw a person who would never leave, no matter how much he pushed. He thought he could have his space and his safety all at once. When you're in a situation like this, it's hard to know when the story actually ends. Is it when you finally pack the bag and don't unpack it? Is it when the post office trips finally lead him to someone else's door? Or is it right now, in the moment I realize that loving someone doesn't mean being their prisoner? I want to know, have any of you ever felt like a burden in your own relationship? Have you ever had your partner tell you they love you, while their every action screamed that they couldn't stand the sight of you? How do you find the strength to leave when you've been told you have nowhere else to go? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your stories might be the lifeline someone else needs to hear today. And if you want to hear more stories about the reality of relationships like this, make sure to subscribe. I'm still here, but for the first time in years, I'm starting to look at the door not as an exit he's using, but as a way out for me. Because no amount of space will ever be enough for a man who doesn't want to be found. And no amount of love is worth the price of disappearing.